Hi, everybody. Okay, we're going to look at exercise 3-3, 3-4, and 3-5, one at a time. They're very confusing, so it helps to have somebody walk you through it with a roadmap. So first, let's look at the textbook. And you'll see here, right after exercise 3-2, where you started using the line command, you start learning about coordinate entry methods. And there are three different coordinate styles. There is absolute coordinates, which measure distances from this 0, 0 origin point where X and Y meet. There are relative coordinates, where each step is what would you call it? Hopscotch from the previous point in space. So you're going from point A to point B to point C to point D. Absolute coordinates, everything goes back to one point A. Relative is like MapQuest. You go from point A to point B to point C. The next one is polar coordinates, where you have a distance and an angle. And polar coordinates are also a type of relative coordinate, so that you want to go from point A to point B to point C. And then there's a coordinate display. Now there's a thing called dynamic input, which was invented to help you not injure your neck. It's this button down at the bottom of the screen, which is not showing up. So let's turn it on. There it is, dynamic input. It's this button right here. It looks like a plus sign with a little rectangle under it. And what that does is it puts the command line, which is normally down at the bottom of the screen, it puts it where your crosshairs are. So the little plus sign in the symbol represents the crosshairs, and the X, or the rectangle, represents the command line. I'll show you what I mean. If I click on the line command, notice what you see right at the crosshairs. You see what is reflected in the command line down at the bottom, but you don't have to bounce your neck and your head up and down, looking at the bottom of the screen, then to the middle of the screen, the bottom of the screen, the middle of the screen. So you pick a point in space and see right in front of your eyes where the crosshairs are. It tells you specify next point in space. You're gonna hit escape, go back. One of the things about dynamic input, which you can turn on and off by pressing the F12, the function 12 key at the top of your keyboard. You can also click on it on and off on the status bar on the bottom of your keyboard. Dynamic input is meant to help you, but it can be confusing because when it's running, it infers relative coordinates. What does that mean? Well, we'll look at that in a minute. First, let's look at, where are we? Here we go. Hopefully you can see this exercise 3-3. 3-3, 3-4, and 3-5 all replicate similar operations using dynamic input, using absolute coordinates, and using relative coordinates. With absolute coordinates, anytime you see something with absolute coordinates, it will always be two numbers separated by a comma. The first number represents the X coordinate. The second number represents the Y coordinate. So if we follow this 3-3, if dynamic input is on, turn it off by picking the button. So let's go to AutoCAD. Okay, it's off. I'm going to make sure it's off. I'm going to get rid of what's on the screen. To make it a little easier, I've added an image of this exercise directly into my AutoCAD screen so I can see exactly what's going on without having to jump back and forth. Okay, so if dynamic input is on, turn it off, picking the dynamic input button. If needed, select the dynamic input option in the status bar, customization flyout to add dynamic input to the status bar. use the line command to draw an object with the absolute coordinates given in the following table. Okay, so the points are each of the points along this step. And the numbers are the absolute locations. Okay, so I'm going to draw that. I'm going to push this over a little bit. I can see my green line which represents Y. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit and pan down just a little bit so I can see these numbers. Okay, so I'm going to start with the line command. And down at the bottom now, dynamic input's off, so I don't see that little rectangle next to my crosshairs. All I have is the command line. It tells me my first point is at 0, 0. So I type 0, 0 into the command line and hit enter. And notice it placed a point at 0, 0. The next point in space is 9, 0, which means 9 inches along the horizontal line and 0 inches along the vertical. Then it gives me 9.5, 0.5, then 9.5, 2, then back to 0, 2, 0, 1.5, 0.25, 0.5, and then back to 0, 0, and enter. Okay, so it creates this shape following these steps. Pretty straightforward. Absolute coordinates are absolutely the worst coordinate system to use, which I think is why they call it absolute coordinates, because it is the absolute worst. And now I'm going to move this drawing up a little bit. I'm going to grab the whole thing, and we'll go over selection methods later on in the chapter. I'm just going to move it up, because the next step says save the drawing as exercise 3-3B, turn dynamic input on, use the line command to draw an object with the absolute coordinates given. So before I do that, I'm going to move this up a little bit. So I want you to see what happens when dynamic input's on, which defers to relative coordinates. Okay, so I start my command over, start with 0, 0. I go to 9, 0, and I go to 9.5, 0.5. Oh no, what's happened? It's gone, it's measured 9.5 inches over and 1/2 inch up from the last place I was, which is relative coordinates. So I need to not panic, I just have to undo. Now, how do I type in absolute coordinates with dynamic input is on? Well, it tells me in the textbook. I go back to the textbook, and it's buried deep in, let's see, where is it? Command line, professional tip. Go back a page, it's here somewhere. Maybe one more. Okay, here we go. Buried deep in paragraph 3 under specifying the next point. Dimensional input is on by default, which means step to step, but you can turn it off temporarily by typing the pound symbol before entering the value. When dimensional input is off, dynamic input defaults to polar format. Okay, what does that mean? That means that if instead of typing 9.5, 5, I type shift 3, which is the pound symbol, then it gives me absolute coordinates again. So I can type 9.5, 5, then pound 3, or uppercase 3, shift 3, and I say 9.5, 2, shift 3, 0, 2, shift 3, 0, 1.25, 1.5, backspace, 1.5, shift 3. Uh-oh, see what's happened? Oh no, I missed a step. Don't panic, just click undo, undo. Okay, so I'm going to, and here's another undo. Okay, so shift 3, 9.5, comma 2. There we go. Shift 3, 0, comma 2. Shift 3, 0, comma 1.5. Shift 3, 0.5, comma 1.25. Shift 3, 0, comma 0, enter. Okay. Now I was just reading the numbers from memory because I didn't want to zoom in and out. So my numbers are a little bit off, but you get the idea. If you're using absolute coordinates, you want to make sure that dynamic input is off. That's all there is to it. So I'm going to end the video at that point.